On August 23, 1864, Abraham Lincoln sat at his desk in the White House and wrote a document he immediately folded and sealed. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't explain it to the men around him. He asked his cabinet to sign the back of it without knowing what was inside, then locked it away. When it was finally opened, months later, the words inside were stark in their honesty. Lincoln had written that it seemed exceedingly probable that his administration would not be re-elected, and that before the new president took office, he would need to cooperate with him to save the Union, because the new president would almost certainly win the war on terms that meant it wasn't really saved at all. The man who had guided the United States through 3 years of catastrophic war had quietly concluded he was finished. The country had turned. Grant was bleeding 30, 40, 60,000 men through the forests and fields of Virginia, and the Army of the Potomac still hadn't broken Lee. The newspapers called it a slaughterhouse. The peace wing of the Democratic Party was gathering real momentum, and their candidate, George McClellan, was polling well enough to make the Republican Party genuinely afraid. There was a word circulating in the summer of 1864 that got passed around in parlors and printed in editorials: exhaustion. The North was exhausted, and an exhausted country does not re-elect the man who is asking it to keep bleeding. Into that particular silence, William Tecumseh Sherman was marching an army into the mountains of northern Georgia. He had started in early May with roughly 100,000 men, 3 armies stitched together under a single command, and his objective was Atlanta. To get there from Chattanooga, he had to move through some of the most defensible terrain on the continent: ridges that ran perpendicular to his line of march, gaps that funneled infantry into kill zones, rivers that gave a defending army every possible advantage. The Confederates holding the ground in front of him had 60,000 men under General Joseph Johnston, a meticulous, calculating officer who had spent the better part of the war making other people's jobs difficult without ever delivering the kind of decisive action his superiors wanted from him. The conventional military wisdom of the era said you did not do what Sherman was doing. You did not drive a 100,000-man army 120 miles into enemy territory on a single railroad line. That line, the Atlantic and Western, running from Chattanooga down through Dalton and Kennesaw all the way to Atlanta, was the throat of Sherman's operation. Everything his army ate, every artillery shell it fired, every replacement rifle that reached the front came down that single track. Cut it anywhere for long enough, and the whole campaign collapsed. Sherman's army would have to retreat or starve. And the Confederacy had cavalry raiders, Bedford Forrest in particular, who had demonstrated repeatedly that they could tear up railroad track faster than engineers could repair it. So the question sitting at the center of this story isn't really about tactics. It's about something more fundamental. Sherman could see the risks as well as anyone. He was not reckless. He had watched his reputation crater early in the war when newspapers called him crazy for warning that the conflict would require far more men and far more sacrifice than anyone in Washington wanted to hear. He had clawed his way back through Shiloh and Vicksburg. He did not take unnecessary gambles. And yet, he pointed his army south toward a city that military logic said he should not be able to take, and marched anyway. Part of the answer lies in what Grant and Sherman had worked out together in the months before the campaign opened. Their plan, at its core, was coordination, something the Union had failed spectacularly to achieve in the first years of the war, when armies sat idle in one theater while other armies needed help, when generals moved at their own pace and on their own timetables, and the Confederacy could strip one front to reinforce another. Grant's insight, the thing he brought to the job of commanding all Union armies, was that the solution was to hit everywhere at once and never let the Confederate armies rest. He would go after Lee personally in Virginia. Sherman would go after Johnston and, through Johnston, after Atlanta. Neither army would be permitted to reinforce the other. Both Confederate armies would have to fight with what they had. Sherman's job, technically, was to defeat Johnston's army, but Sherman was already thinking past that. Atlanta sat at the junction of four major railroads. Lose Atlanta, and the Confederacy lost the ability to move men and supplies efficiently across the Deep South. Lose Atlanta, and the war industries concentrated in and around the city, the rolling mills, the arsenal, the machine shops, were gone. Lose Atlanta, and the psychological blow to Confederate civilians who had been told for 3 years that their armies were winning would be severe enough to matter. Sherman had come to believe, in a way that most of his contemporaries had not yet articulated, that the Confederate war effort ran on two things simultaneously: the capacity of its armies in the field and the willingness of the population behind those armies to keep feeding them men and money and belief. Smash the first, and you still had the second to contend with. You had to threaten both. The campaign from Chattanooga to Atlanta took 4 months and played out in a pattern that initially seemed to favor Johnston. He would anchor his man on a ridge or a river. Sherman would probe the front, find it too strong to assault directly, then send a column swinging around one flank or the other to threaten Johnston's supply line and force him back. Rocky Face Ridge, Resaca, Cassville, Allatoona Pass, Dallas, Kennesaw Mountain. The Confederate Army was retreating steadily, but it was not being destroyed. Johnston was trading space for time and betting that Sherman would eventually overextend himself, that the single railroad would be cut, that an assault would go wrong and the Union Army would break. It was, from a purely defensive standpoint, a rational strategy. Johnston understood what Sherman needed. He needed a decisive engagement that wrecked the Confederate Army and made Atlanta indefensible, and he refused to give it to him. Every ridge he held made Sherman fight for it or go around it. Going around it cost time and miles. Every week the campaign dragged on was another week of Northern newspaper headlines about stalemate, another week of McClellan's poll numbers holding steady. The one moment Johnston came close to pulling Sherman into a trap was at Kennesaw Mountain in late June. Sherman, growing impatient with the flanking game and genuinely concerned about the length of his supply line relative to his combat strength, ordered a frontal assault against prepared Confederate positions on the face of the mountain. The attack went in on June 27th. 3,000 Union soldiers became casualties in a matter of hours. The Confederate lines held. Sherman wrote in his letters afterward that he regretted it, not the decision to try, but the execution, the failure to find the soft spots before committing. Within 2 weeks he was flanking again, and Johnston was falling back toward Atlanta. What happened next is the thing that changed everything, and it did not come from Sherman's headquarters, it came from Richmond. Jefferson Davis had tolerated Johnston's retreating for months, bombarding him with letters demanding to know his plan, demanding to know when he intended to fight, demanding to know at what point he would stop giving ground. Johnston's responses were careful and often evasive. He outlined his difficulties. He explained his reasoning. He did not give Davis what Davis needed, which was a promise to hold Atlanta or a credible plan to attack Sherman. On July 17, 1864, with Sherman's army across the Chattahoochee and Atlanta in visible danger, Davis relieved Johnston of command and replaced him with John Bell Hood. Hood was 33 years old and had spent the war proving himself as an aggressive, ferociously brave combat officer. He had lost the use of his left arm at Gettysburg. He had lost his right leg at Chickamauga. He commanded from his saddle with his amputated leg strapped to the horse, and his men adored him for it. He was also, as a theater-level army commander, dangerously unsuited to the job he had just been given. He had no experience commanding an army. He had no patience for the kind of operational maneuvering that Johnston had used to keep the Confederate army intact. Hood believed in attacking. Within 3 days of taking command, he attacked. The Battle of Peachtree Creek, July 20th. The Battle of Atlanta, July 22nd. The Battle of Ezra Church, July 28th. 3 separate major assaults in 8 days, each one costing the Confederate Army thousands of men it had no way to replace. At Peachtree Creek, Hood lost nearly 5,000 men. At the Battle of Atlanta, 8,000. At Ezra Church, another 3,000. In less than 2 weeks, he had expended somewhere between a third and a quarter of his effective combat strength in attacks that didn't break the Union lines. Sherman's army absorbed each one, pulled together, counterattacked where it could, and tightened the ring. Sherman couldn't breach Atlanta's fortifications from the front, but Hood had already solved that problem for him by burning through his army's offensive strength. With the Confederate army weakened and now pinned behind the city's defenses, Sherman went wide. He sent his cavalry first in late July, hoping to cut the Macon and Western Railroad south of Atlanta, the last line still feeding the city. The cavalry missions failed. Then, in late August, he moved the bulk of his army. He pulled nearly all his forces away from the northern face of Atlanta's defenses and drove them in a sweeping arc around the western and southern flanks, aiming for the railroad at Jonesborough, 30 miles south of the city. Hood, confused about what Sherman was actually doing, made the wrong read on the movement and sent troops to Jonesborough a day late. The Confederates fought desperately at Jonesborough on August 31 and September 1 and lost. The railroad was cut. With Atlanta no longer logistically viable as a base, Hood ordered the city evacuated and destroyed what he couldn't carry. On September 2, 1864, Sherman telegraphed Washington, "Atlanta is ours," and fairly won. Lincoln read that message, and the political equation of the war shifted in a single afternoon. The timing was precise enough to seem almost staged, but it wasn't. Sherman had been fighting for 4 months, and the fall of Atlanta arrived exactly when the Northern public needed it most, 6 weeks before the presidential election, with McClellan and the Peace Democrats at the height of their influence, with Lincoln's private letter of defeat still locked in his desk. Atlanta landing in Union hands did not simply give Lincoln a military victory to campaign on, it reframed the entire argument. If Atlanta had fallen, if the Confederacy's great rail hub was gone, and Sherman was standing in the middle of Georgia, then the war was not a stalemate. It was not the grinding slaughterhouse that the peacemen had been describing. It was something being won, specifically and measurably, by the men Lincoln had put in charge of winning it. In November, Lincoln won re-election with 55% of the popular vote and 212 electoral votes. He carried the soldier vote by something like 70%. The men doing the fighting had decided the fight was worth finishing. None of that happens if Sherman turns back. And going back to the original question, why didn't he? The answer isn't one thing. It's a stack of calculated judgments, some of which Sherman made and some of which his opponents made for him. Sherman's decision to advance was built on a read of Johnston that proved accurate. He believed Johnston would not take the kind of offensive risk that could destroy a Union army. Johnston was not Stonewall Jackson. He was not going to leave his prepared defenses, march through the night, and collapse Sherman's flank while the Army of Tennessee was still finding its breakfast. He would hold, fall back, and hold again. Sherman could work with that. A careful, defensive opponent who prioritized army preservation over bold action was an opponent Sherman could maneuver around indefinitely, as long as his own supply line held. And the supply line held because Sherman did something that gets less attention than his marching. He spent months before the campaign even began turning the railroad between Nashville and Chattanooga into a functional military artery. He restricted civilian use. He flooded the line with repair crews. He built up massive supply depots at Chattanooga and at forward positions as the Army advanced, so that a break in the line meant days of disruption rather than catastrophic collapse. When Confederate cavalry did raid the railroad, and they did repeatedly, the repair crews were already moving before the raiders had ridden clear. At one point, Sherman's engineers rebuilt a 100-foot bridge in less than 2 days. A Confederate general, watching this from a distance, reportedly said that Sherman must carry spare tunnels in his wagon trains. Bedford Forrest, the one raider who genuinely frightened Sherman, was kept occupied in Mississippi and Tennessee, fighting Union forces specifically tasked with preventing him from reaching the railroad. Sherman wrote repeatedly to his subordinates that if Forrest got loose against his supply line, the whole campaign was in danger. He was not casual about it. He was vigilant about it for 4 months. The fact that Forrest never cut the railroad was not luck. It was the product of deliberate, sustained effort to keep him busy elsewhere. So, the risk that looks most obvious in hindsight, a single railroad supplying an army deep in enemy territory, was not left to chance. It was managed. What Sherman could not have fully controlled was the Confederate decision-making in Richmond. Johnston's replacement with Hood was a gift, not because Hood was incompetent in every sense. Hood was a ferocious fighter and his men respected him, but because Hood's method of fighting was exactly wrong for the situation he'd inherited. He attacked when he needed to conserve. He depleted irreplaceable veterans in assaults that didn't achieve their objectives. He handed Sherman's army opportunities to inflict massive casualties while behind prepared defenses. If Johnston had remained in command through August, Atlanta might have held longer. The siege might have dragged into fall. The political calendar might have run out. Lincoln might have lost. Davis never understood this, or if he did, he couldn't afford to say so. He had been pushing for aggressive action from Johnston for months. When he got it from Hood, it came with a bill attached that the Confederacy couldn't pay. There's something worth sitting with in the gap between how this campaign is usually described and what it actually was. Sherman is often framed as a juggernaut, a force of nature grinding down a weaker enemy, the 100,000-man Union Army rolling over 60,000 Confederates, the industrial North overwhelming the agricultural South. That framing is not wrong exactly, but it flattens what happened. For the first half of the campaign, Johnston was not being overwhelmed. He was holding. The numbers advantage Sherman brought to Georgia didn't translate automatically to Confederate collapse. Johnston absorbed every flanking move, every pressure, every probe, and kept his army coherent. If the Confederacy had the depth to simply keep replacing armies like Johnston's as fast as Sherman wore them down, the outcome might have been different. What broke Atlanta wasn't numbers alone. It was the interaction between Sherman's patience and Hood's impatience. Sherman built his operation around the idea that he did not need to destroy Johnston in a single battle. He could wear him down, stretch his supply situation, and wait for something to go wrong on the Confederate side. Hood's appointment was something going wrong on the Confederate side. The open battles Hood demanded were the battles Sherman's army was better equipped to fight. The siege Hood inherited was the trap Hood didn't know how to escape. When Sherman sent his final flanking column southwest toward Jonesborough in late August, he was executing a move that he had been building toward for weeks, waiting for the moment when Hood had used enough of his army trying to break the Union lines that he couldn't cover both the city and the rail lines simultaneously. Hood had spent July spending men he couldn't afford to spend. By August, he was short. When Sherman moved, Hood didn't have enough to stop him and defend Atlanta at the same time. The city fell on September 2. Sherman ordered a portion of its industrial and military infrastructure demolished, the rail yards, the warehouses, the rolling mill, the depot, before marching on in November toward Savannah. He would later say that war was cruelty and you couldn't refine it, and that the sooner the South understood the North would not relent, the sooner the dying would stop. Atlanta's fall was an argument for that position, made in burning rail yards and abandoned fortifications. It said, "You cannot hold what we want to take." And it said it at exactly the moment when half the country was asking whether the effort was worth continuing. Sherman shouldn't have taken Atlanta in the sense that the campaign violated several rules careful officers kept close. Don't drive deep on a single supply line. Don't lay siege to a fortified city when you lack the numbers to guarantee its quick fall. Don't let an opponent pick the ground and the timing for 4 months and expect to still be in a position to win. Those rules exist because ignoring them has ended careers and armies. But Sherman did something that rule writers often don't fully account for. He understood the strategic environment he was operating inside, not just the tactical one. He understood that the Confederate army in front of him would not take the risks required to destroy him. He understood that his supply line could be defended if he worked at it. He understood that the clock was running in ways that made the risk of inaction equivalent to the risk of action. That if he sat in Chattanooga waiting for a safer opportunity, the war's political support in the North might not survive the wait. And he understood, even before he crossed into Georgia, that he was fighting for something beyond the next ridge. He was fighting for Lincoln's ability to finish what had been started. The sealed letter Lincoln wrote in August, the one where he recorded his own expected political death, was opened after the election, after Lincoln had won. He read it aloud to his cabinet. They laughed a little at how wrong it turned out to be. None of them mentioned Sherman by name in the accounts that survived. But the arithmetic was simple enough. The letter was written 10 days before Atlanta fell. The election was won 6 weeks after it fell. Whatever happened in between happened because one man marched an army where no sane man should have been able to march it, held it together on a thread of railroad and iron discipline for 4 months, and gave the president the one thing no speech or pamphlet could have manufactured: a fact, a city, a reason to believe the whole thing was still winnable.